Okay. Hello and welcome. My name's Ned Burwell. I am your host and the creator of Umatter. I'm here today with Nadine she is the director and founder of CHATT Incorporated. I love the name of your business. What does it mean?
It's an acronym for Community Health Assessment and Therapy Team. We originated in Caledon, and it was originally the Caledon Health Assessment and Therapy Team. But when we moved to Ingersoll, we decided to change the name to reflect that we have services that do meet the needs of the entire community: children, couples, adults, families, and groups.
It's a great name, and I love the acronym. I noticed that last night when I was looking at your website.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's meaningful for the business that you do.
Yeah, it's also my idea that obtaining mental health services doesn't have to be clinical. That we can sit and have a coffee and a chat in a comfortable couch in a comfortable room with a comfortable person, and it helps to break the stigma of getting help when we have services like ours available.
That's right. And you have a team of 7 therapists.
That's right. We have 7 therapists, and we're supervised by psychologists. And about half of our therapists specialize, or even more actually, specialize in working with children, families, and couples. And then we have a couple of therapists that focused almost entirely on adult mental health needs.
That's great. So today, and you yourself, you're a cognitive behavioral therapist?
That's correct.
And we're doing this video today to talk about the topic of guilt.
That's right. Now, guilt is something that I feel comes up a lot in my therapy sessions. It seems to be connected to a lot of other feelings. Sometimes guilt isn't the feeling that is first identified. Sometimes it's sadness or self-esteem issues or anxiety, but underneath it all is the sense of not having done or not being enough and feeling guilty about some sort of expectation that a person would have that they're simply not reaching.
I think we've all had that feeling like I'm not enough, and I've had that feeling many times in my life.
It's really part of the human condition. I think we all have, Ned.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you briefly described there, but is there a way that we create that outside of what you just said there?
Well, definitely. I mean, first and foremost, guilt, like all emotions, is not a bad emotion. It feels yucky sometimes to us, but all emotions have a function. And the function of guilt is simply to remind us that we have a code of ethics, a moral code that we're not living up to in some way. And so when guilt occurs, it is important to, in some ways, listen to the guilt and be able to attend to what it's trying to tell us in terms of how are my actions, thoughts, or inactions not meeting with some expectation or ideal that I have about myself.
Mm-hmm. And how does it affect our lives, the topic of guilt?
So when we're feeling guilty, a lot of times, if we can just take from that message what we need to learn and move on, then that would be healthy guilt. That would be the kind of guilt that we would all want, is just simply to be able to say, I said I was going to do the housework today, but I didn't, so now I feel guilty that I have a messy house and my kids get to come home to that. So what I need to do, instead of saying I should have and beating myself up, is simply to change the language that we use when we talk about things that we feel we regret, and change it from I should have done different to I would prefer to have done different, and since I didn't, then I need to make a plan so that next time I will do different, or starting right now or tomorrow I will do different. It's such a huge change in the way that we feel about ourselves with guilt. If we change the word should, almost entirely eradicate it from our vocabulary and change it to other things such as this is what I will do as opposed to what I should do. The other thing about guilt is that, speaking of it being a healthy emotion, is that people who don't experience any guilt, we label as psychopaths. So when we have a good, healthy amount of guilt, then that actually means that we're functioning as a human being with emotions like empathy, compassion, caring, drive. It's not just a negative emotion in any capacity.
So it can be a good thing in our life too, then.
That's right, but it does become a problem when a person can't let go of it, and that's because a lot of times the messages that we will take from the situation that made us feel guilty. We internalize them from I didn't do right to I'm a bad person because I didn't do right. Or other ways that we might think about it is because I made this mistake once in my life, I'm bound to repeat that mistake over and over and over again and somehow ruin my life. Or sometimes we feel as though we failed another person, like in particular parents have a lot of guilt when it comes to parenting. So if we make a mistake as a parent, we'll start to think that we might have ruined our children, or that we're a bad mother or a bad father. And so those kinds of instances of guilt, again, we have to attend to whether there's a little kernel of truth. You know, if we are doing something that isn't good for our lives or our children, then we do need to come up with a plan to make it better. But at the same time, it's not healthy to internalize it and beat ourselves up and say, and I'm a bad person because, or I'm a bad parent because. That's called labeling. And along with the other things that I mentioned, those are thinking errors. So thinking errors such as overgeneralization. If I do it once, it'll happen over and over and over again. Or another thinking error of catastrophization. So if I do this, I will ruin my whole life. That kind of thing. So one of the things we do in therapy is we do learn a lot about thinking errors and how they get in the way of us having more adaptive, healthy patterns of thought that are better for self-esteem and actually help us to stay motivated and productive as well.
I've noticed that I do that. I've done that many times in my life where I do something and then I hold myself in that moment and I get stuck there.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and then next thing you know, weeks pass, but I'm still back in that incident.
That's common, and it comes from a fear of not having learned from it, a fear that you would repeat it over and over again. So that's healthy in a way too, but what we tend to do that's not healthy is simply beat ourselves up about it and not come up with a better solution for moving forward.
So how do we come up with that solution? How do we not hold ourselves to something that we feel bad about?
Well, first part is to remember that we sometimes have rules for ourselves, like it's not okay to make a mistake, or it's never okay to hurt somebody, even if you don't mean the harm. And those kinds of rules can get in the way. So it would be important for us to recognize that we're human beings, and we're going to make mistakes, and we're going to make decisions that aren't always the best for us or for our families. And as much as we want to minimize those things, obviously, it's important to pay attention to when they do happen so we can come up with a better plan. Not internalize it as though we're beating ourselves up. I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. If we were trying to coach a child's baseball team or something, as a coach, we know inherently not to ridicule the children, not to say, if we want to motivate them, we're never going to say things like, you're terrible, you're awful, you're horrible. And yet, for some reason, people think that if they apply the same logic to their own selves, if they beat themselves up with words like that, like you're a horrible person and you don't deserve any better, that'll somehow motivate us into change. How often does that actually happen? Right?
I've spent a great deal of time looking at the dialogue that's in my mind and cleaning up my language.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what it really comes down to, is to be able to not only be able to identify the word should and replace it with prefer, but also to look back on the situation and ask yourself, how does it actually make sense that I made the choice that I did? How does it actually make sense that, for example, if somebody hurt me, that I didn't tell? For example, with a lot of my clients who have had childhood abuse, if they didn't tell, then there's probably a reason for that. And I say to them, ask yourselves, what was the reason that you didn't tell? What made sense about that? And for most of them, the answers are obvious, and they'll be able to say, because I knew I wouldn't be believed, because it would hurt my parents, because it would ruin my family, because I didn't want the perpetrator to go to jail, or for whatever reason, it made sense to them in that moment to make the choice that they made in that moment. And it's about finding a way to validate the child within in those situations. Or as adults, when we make a mistake, to validate our humanness and be able to say, well, of course, that decision made sense based on all of these different opposing forces that made that decision logical in that moment.
And back then, that whenever the situation that is causing somebody to feel guilty, back then, they were just acting in their level of consciousness or
That's right.
their operating ability.
And then when we're in flight and flight mode as well, our cognitive resources are depleted, meaning that we really don't have the ability to always make the decisions with all of the options on the table. We tend to operate in a place of fear or flight. Fight or flight is what they talk about. And a lot of times if both fight and flight won't save you, we freeze. And so there's that element as well.
Because I know, I keep relating this back to myself, but I've been in positions in my life where I felt very disempowered and then made decisions based on my disempowerment at that time. And years later, if I'm still holding myself, I'm not in that disempowered state, so why would I hold myself to that place?
Exactly, and that's where a lot of self-compassion and empathy really comes in handy. It helps to ask yourself the question of, if it wasn't me who made this decision, if it was a friend of mine, if it was someone that I cared about, if you're looking back at something you did as a child, for example, if it was another child that you knew had done something similar, would you feel the same way you feel towards yourself if it was someone else? Would you say the same things that you say to yourself if it were someone else? If we say no and we say, actually no, I would be much more compassionate, I would understand, I would offer them support, I would be a friend, I would say, it's okay, I understand, then we need to do those things for ourselves as well.
That's great advice. And so is there, so say I'm feeling guilty right now, what are the first kind of clear steps that I could take to move out of that experience that I'm having?
I like how you phrased the question, because the first step would be awareness, and I think that's the one that you've just nailed right there, is to be aware that what it is that you're feeling is guilt.
So notice that I'm feeling guilty.
Definitely. Okay. Or notice that you're feeling something, and then put the words to that something by saying, what was going through my mind right before I started to feel this way? And see if it does match up with an ideal that something could or should have been different than what it was, then you're probably talking about guilt. The word should is a really important earmark. Now, when I say we try to avoid the word should, I don't mean that we just cut it out of our vocabulary. I may have even said that. It will appear in your mind, and then we replace it. So it's not like we would need to then feel guilty for saying should or shouldn't.
That's right.
I have some clients that are like, oh, I just said should, and they'll go, oh, like
and
this.
They'll feel guilty about it.
And they'll feel guilty about that. So it isn't about that so much as noticing it and then correcting yourself and being okay with the fact that you need to correct yourself sometimes. So the word should is an indicator, or should not, depending on if it's something that we did or didn't do. And then from there, how is my choice logical based on where I was at the time? That's where hindsight bias can also come in, is if we feel as though we should have known something that wasn't knowable at the time, that only when we have the outcome can we reflect back and say, I should have known better. That's an example of hindsight bias, which it can get in the way of us having healthy thoughts about our own power and control in the situation. It's sort of like survivor guilt, for example. I had a friend who died in high school, and I felt really guilty because had I been with him at that time, I would have stopped him from doing the stupid thing that ultimately ended in his death, because he was taking some very bad chances and risks at the time. The logic there, it's just not there, right? I mean, I could have saved him had I been with him, but how would I know, right? So that's something that I was able
without having that piece of information.
Without knowing that it was going to happen, right?
You just didn't put it together.
Yeah. But survivor guilt is also a really normal human emotion, right? It's the idea of just trying to claim some sort of, make some sort of sense out of it. So if we can say that had I been there, it would have been different, then that gives us a sense that if anyone else in my life that I love was in danger, that I could prevent them from having a similar fate, knowing that if I were there, I could have saved him.
That's right.
So it actually is a bit of a way that we reassure ourselves that, you know, we come up with a bit of a plan for if it ever should happen again, I know that I would be able to hopefully do something that would give me some control in a situation that ultimately was not within our control.
So let me recap this. If I'm feeling guilty, so I identify there's guilt. Next thing I do is take inventory of what's happening,
Yep.
what's causing me to feel this
The
way.
situation, exactly.
3, I wouldn't should on myself.
Yeah, they call it shitty thinking, actually,
Shitty
which
thinking.
is kind of funny.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it.
Eliminate the shitty thinking, right? And that's the shitty thinking.
And then I would bring compassion to myself.
Bring compassion as well as reasonable, logical explanations for why the decision made sense. If it's something like smoking and somebody wants to quit smoking and they have for a length of time and then they lit up again, right? An example would be to be able to say, well, what was going on in my life that made it extra hard to not have that cigarette in that moment? How can I come up with a plan for the next time I'm in that situation to perhaps choose differently? That kind of thing. And then the self-compassion, of course, is an important piece. And we take from it what we need to learn. And remember that we're human and we're going to make mistakes, and that's just a part of being alive.
Well, I think that identifying triggers too is a good point. If we're experiencing repetitive guilt, where we notice it on a daily basis or a weekly, we get into this, we fall into the rut of that pattern of thinking. Is there something that triggers us? So on the other side of an experience with guilt, if we can identify what's triggering that's
Exactly.
really good information for us.
And the other thing to keep in mind is that when we start to personalize it and we say, because I'm making this mistake over and over again, that means X, Y, Z about myself or my future. And if you start labeling yourself as a bad person or a hopeless person or a useless person, or, if it brings up memories of someone else in your life who would shame you and blame you for things, and you're internalizing that voice, it's probably a good time to seek some counseling, because those are self-esteem issues and those go much deeper. And yes, we can definitely make a difference through looking at those guilt experiences in therapy, but it's probably more in depth than what a person is going to be able to succeed at least quickly on their own.
And at times we do need people we need to bounce our stuff off people and say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. And the second party will offer us some wisdom that we may not have.
Exactly.
And it sheds a new light on our situation.
Exactly.
I was just writing about that the other day, about how we personalize things. We do something and we'll start out with saying, that was stupid. And then next thing you know, it turns into, I'm stupid.
That's right.
And at that point, that's where we become very disempowered.
And that's where cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. Cognitive means thinking, and behavior is behavior, and therapy is therapy. So the term CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, refers to our ability to not only notice the inner dialogue that we have about ourselves, our future, our lives, and other people, but to be able to notice when it's accurate and helpful, and when it's simply not helpful and not accurate. And typically not accurate and not helpful go together. So that it's actually not true, and that's where the thinking errors come in. So for example, if I had a person who said that they're not lovable, nobody likes them, for example, then we would come up with examples of little moments in time where they were proven to be more likable than what they originally thought. And also take some examples of when they thought they were being unlikable and challenge them by applying some logic to that and saying, well, just because no one talked to you at that party doesn't mean that you're unlikable. What are some other possible reasons that no one talked to you at that party? For example, you were on your phone the whole time because you were super anxious and nervous about being at the party, that people thought you were busy and didn't disturb you, for example. Like, we would go through all the different possibilities, but people would start to challenge their beliefs about themselves in a way that can start to feel really exceptionally good. Because logic is, I can't tell you you're great and wonderful and consider that good therapy. You're not going to believe me, right? But when we can prove it through examples that you take from your own life, then it starts to waver your beliefs in a positive direction.
That's great information, and you're sort of leading into 3 more interviews I would love to have with you. Now, when we're in the topic of guilt, is there different types of guilt that we can experience, or is there just this thing, guilt?
Well, I think that guilt has so many different forms. It really depends on the situation and again, whether or not we're internalizing it. But there's maybe 5 of the major different types as identified in Psychology Today magazine. One is guilt for something that we did. So I made a mistake, or I did something selfish, or whatever it is, and I feel guilty. The second type would be guilt for something that we didn't do. So as I mentioned before, the shoulds and the should nots, right? A third type of guilt would be sort of like that survivor guilt, the idea of I could have done more. It's an interesting one, because sometimes another thing that will come up for people is that they're darned if they do or they're darned if they don't. So for example, if you had an elderly parent and you were feeling guilty because you couldn't do more for them because you also had a family with demands, then you're going to feel guilty if you spend too much time at your parents' house, and you're going to feel guilty if you spend too much time at your own house. Guilt is going to be inevitable. And so we just pay attention to the ethics behind that guilt to say, yes, my value is that I need to be there for them and I need to be there for them, but the logic of the situation is I can't be there for everyone. And that helps us to feel a little bit more compassionate and reasonable with ourselves. So that's the third type. The fourth type would be guilt from the perception that you're doing better than another person. So guilt for being a success. This kind of guilt is common with, well, if we look at pictures of starving children in those infomercials, for example, we might feel guilty if we're watching starving children and eating a sandwich at the same time. Another example would be a lot of newcomers to Canada will give their children the very best life they can and give them all these opportunities that they may or may not have had in their own country of origin. And some kids will sort of self-sabotage a little bit because they don't feel comfortable doing better than their parents, that they feel guilty for having in some way gone further in school or done better than their parents, and that they would self-sabotage, and that's something we get in therapy sometimes as well. That's 4 types. What's the 5th type? Oh, right. Guilt for magical thinking, such as I hate you and I wish something bad would happen to you, and then the next day you find out that something actually did happen that's bad, and then you feel guilty as though you've caused it in some way, which of course we know doesn't really happen.
Magical thinking.
Magical
That's
thinking.
an interesting title to that.
Yeah.
That's great. Now, is there anything that you want to leave us with? Any concluding thoughts on the topic of guilt?
That's a good question. I just want to emphasize that as much as we can do some really important and great steps on our own by recognizing that we're human, having compassion, noticing the word should, changing the word should to something like prefer, then saying, but of course I made this decision, and of course, it made sense. To know that at some point, if you're still wrestling with guilt and you can't just make it better on your own, or if self-esteem is taking a major hit, then maybe it's a good time to reach out to a therapist such as myself and get a deeper perspective and some more tools that will help you to overcome it altogether.
Well, thank you, Nadine. I appreciate you doing this interview. Thank you for watching. Please let your friends and family know about this video. Share it on your social media. Share it around. We need to get this message out. If you are struggling, or if anyone you know is struggling, or you just need someone to talk to, feel free to call the number on the screen, and help is closer than you think. Thank you.
Thank you.